Looking back on it all now, I sometimes wonder how I didn't see the cracks forming earlier. Hindsight, they say, is always clearer. For the longest time, I believed that my marriage to Mia was built on trust, love, and shared dreams. We had been together for 5 years. 3 of those as a couple head over heels in love, and 2 as husband and wife. But I suppose the truth has a way of lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I met Mia, I was 30, a focused and driven accountant who knew where I was heading in life. She was 28, a stunning woman with an infectious smile and dreams of her own. We clicked immediately, and it wasn't long before our relationship became the kind of partnership I had always imagined marriage would be. Or so I thought. Mia had been working at a boutique when we got married. She loved it, or at least she claimed she did. But shortly after our honeymoon, she announced that she wanted to quit her job. "I want to focus on building our home, Alex," she had said with a certainty I found hard to argue with. How could I? I was thrilled at the idea of us creating a life together, and if that meant I had to be the sole breadwinner, I was more than willing to shoulder the responsibility. After all, wasn't that what husbands were supposed to do? For a while, everything seemed fine. Better than fine, even. Mia threw herself into managing our household with the same enthusiasm she had once shown at her boutique job. Our small apartment became a warm, inviting space where I could unwind after long days at work. She cooked elaborate meals, took care of the little details that often slipped my mind, and made our home feel like a sanctuary. But slowly, things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. A missed kiss goodbye in the morning, an absent-minded response when I asked how her day had been. Then it became harder to ignore. She started spending more time out of the house, claiming she needed to meet friends or go to the gym. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now glued to her side. She was constantly distracted, her mind seemingly a million miles away. I tried to brush off the growing sense of unease. Maybe she was just adjusting to being a full-time homemaker. Maybe she needed space to find herself in this new chapter of our lives. I told myself that I was overthinking things, that my trust in her was unshakable. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that something wasn't right. There were moments when I caught her staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Part sadness, part resentment. I would ask if everything was okay, and she would plaster on a smile that didn't reach her eyes and say, "Of course, Alex, why wouldn't it be?" Yet the distance between us only grew. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now felt forced. Laughter that used to come naturally was replaced by awkward silences. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, walking on eggshells around a woman I barely recognized. Still, I held on to the belief that we could work through it. Marriage wasn't supposed to be easy, right? Everyone had rough patches. I was determined to be patient, to give her the space she seemed to need, and to prove that I was committed to making our relationship work. What I didn't realize at the time was that the foundation of our marriage had already begun to crack. And no matter how much effort I put into patching it up, it was only a matter of time before everything came crumbling down. They say the truth always comes out, but I didn't expect it to hit me like a freight train on an ordinary Tuesday evening. It had been one of those long days at work, the kind where the numbers blur together and the clock seems frozen. I was relieved to finally come home, hoping for a warm dinner and maybe a quiet evening with Mia. Little did I know, that night would forever change how I saw her, and us. Mia was unusually quiet when I walked in. She gave me a half-hearted smile, murmured something about being tired, and went to the living room with her phone. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd had many evenings where she seemed lost in thought, distracted by who knows what. But something about her demeanor unsettled me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt that nagging sense again. Something wasn't right. After dinner, Mia fell asleep on the couch, her phone clutched loosely in her hand. It buzzed repeatedly, and curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over, thinking it might be a notification about some gym class or a friend's message. But the words on the screen made my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, babe. You looked amazing in class today." My heart stopped. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely there was some mistake. But the name at the top of the message, Ryan, sent a chill down my spine. Ryan was her gym trainer, someone she had mentioned in passing, but never with much detail. I wanted to believe it was innocent, that there was some logical explanation. But the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Unable to resist, I unlocked her phone with the passcode I'd memorized long ago but had never felt the need to use. What I found shattered me. Message after message, explicit and undeniable, left no room for doubt. They weren't just exchanging flirty texts. They were planning rendezvous, sharing intimate details, and mocking me in the process. I sat there, phone in hand, my chest tightening as anger, betrayal, and heartbreak collided. The woman I had trusted with my life, the woman I thought I knew, had been living a double life. And the worst part? She hadn't even tried to hide it. When Mia stirred awake, I confronted her immediately. My voice was calm, too calm, considering the storm brewing inside me. "Mia," I said, holding up her phone. "Care to explain this?" She didn't even flinch. There was no denial, no attempt to make excuses. Instead, she sat up, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "I think it's time we talk, Alex. I want a divorce." Just like that. No apology, no remorse. She spoke as if she were discussing the weather, not the destruction of our marriage. Her coldness was almost worse than the affair itself. "I'll need half of everything," she added, her voice devoid of emotion. "The house, the savings, everything we've built together. It's only fair." Fair? The word felt like a slap to the face. How could she stand there so composed after tearing my world apart? I couldn't even find the words to respond. My hands trembled as I placed her phone on the table, my mind racing through every memory of our life together, now tainted by her betrayal. She didn't wait for me to react. She simply got up, walked to the bedroom, and shut the door. I sat there in stunned silence, my world crumbling around me. The love I had once felt for Mia was still there, buried under layers of shock and anger. But I knew it would never be the same. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? I kept replaying her words, her tone, her utter lack of remorse. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her freedom. But as the hours dragged on, a new feeling began to emerge. Resolve. If Mia wanted to destroy everything we had built together, I wouldn't make it easy for her. I had a life before her, and I would have a life after her. She didn't know it yet, but this battle was just beginning. The night after Mia's cold declaration of divorce, I sat in our dimly lit living room, my mind racing. Her audacity was staggering. She had torn apart our marriage, brazenly flaunted her betrayal, and now she wanted half of everything we had built together. At first, I felt cornered, like she held all the cards. But then, a memory surfaced. A conversation with my father years ago that now seemed prophetic. I remember sitting with Dad on the back porch of his house shortly after Mia and I got engaged. He had been my rock, guiding me through life with advice that I sometimes thought was overly cautious. That day, he had leaned in with an intensity that caught me off guard. "Son," he began, "marriage is a beautiful thing, but it's also unpredictable. People change, circumstances change. Love is important, but so is protecting yourself. Always safeguard what you've worked hard for." At the time, I dismissed it as old-fashioned thinking. Mia and I were in love. Why would I need to safeguard anything? But Dad was insistent. "Put the house in my name," he said. "Keep the major investments under the family trust. It's not about not trusting her. It's about being prepared for anything." Reluctantly, I agreed. I didn't think I'd ever need to fall back on those measures, but Dad's advice was rooted in experience, and I respected that. Over the next few months, I quietly transferred ownership of the house and significant savings to accounts under my father's name. My investments were tied to a family trust, entirely separate from anything Mia or I shared. It wasn't that I didn't trust Mia. It was more about the security of knowing that no matter what, I wouldn't lose everything. Fast forward to now, sitting alone in that same house Mia thought she could claim half of, I felt a strange sense of relief. She had no idea. For all her bravado, for all her demands, she didn't know the real truth about our finances. The next morning, Mia walked into the kitchen looking smug, as if she had already calculated the windfall she was about to receive. I could barely meet her gaze without my anger bubbling over, but I forced myself to stay calm. If there was one thing I'd learned in my career, it was the power of patience and strategy. "You'll need to start the process," she said, sipping her coffee like we were discussing something as mundane as grocery shopping. "We'll split the assets, and I'll move out once everything's finalized. I want this to be clean and quick." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Of course, Mia, I'll take care of it." She smirked, clearly interpreting my compliance as submission. What she didn't know was that I had already contacted my lawyer, a quiet, sharp man named Robert who specialized in airtight financial cases. I wasn't going to fight dirty, but I wasn't going to be a doormat either. As I gathered the documents for our legal proceedings, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Mia would walk into this thinking she had won, thinking her demands would be met without question. But the reality was going to hit her like a freight train. The house? Not hers. The savings? Not accessible. The investments? Locked away in a trust she had no claim to. By the time I finished organizing the paperwork, I felt a small but significant shift in my perspective. The betrayal still stung, and the anger was still raw, but I no longer felt powerless. Mia's cold detachment had blindsided me, but she underestimated me. That evening, as Mia sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, probably texting Ryan, I allowed myself a small, private smile. She thought she had me trapped, but the truth was, she was the one walking into a trap. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand, and while I didn't revel in the idea of revenge, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that her arrogance would soon come face to face with reality. The first thing I learned about divorce proceedings is that they're not as quick or straightforward as movies make them seem. Once Mia announced her intentions, she wasted no time hiring one of the most aggressive lawyers in town. From what I gathered, this guy had a reputation for squeezing ex-spouses dry. It was almost laughable, given what I knew she'd eventually discover. Almost. Mia's smugness only grew as she updated me on her lawyer's plans. "He says I can expect half of everything," she told me one evening, barely masking her satisfaction. "The house, the savings, even the investments. It's all marital property." She said it so confidently, so self-assured, that I had to bite back a smile. I didn't argue with her. Why would I? Let her bask in her illusions for a little while longer. Meanwhile, I quietly contacted Robert, my lawyer. He was the exact opposite of Mia's flashy choice. While her lawyer thrived on theatrics and intimidation, Robert was a calm, calculating expert who preferred to let the facts do the talking. "Alex," Robert said during our first meeting, "you've done everything right. Your financial arrangements are airtight. But be prepared. This isn't just about money for her. People like Mia don't like losing, and when she realizes she doesn't have the upper hand, things might get ugly." He wasn't wrong. The first step was the asset disclosure process. It's a standard part of any divorce. Both parties lay all their cards on the table, detailing what they own and what they owe. Mia probably thought this would be the moment she cornered me, demanding her share of the spoils. I could practically see her rehearsing the victory speech in her head. When the day came, I handed over my financial documents without hesitation. Mia's lawyer pounced on them like a shark scenting blood, scanning the pages with a gleam in his eye. But then, slowly, that gleam faded. "This can't be right," he muttered, flipping back and forth through the papers. "It's all there," I said calmly, gesturing to the documents. "The assets in my name, as required. The house, legally owned by my father. The investments, tied up in a family trust established long before Mia and I met. The savings, minimal compared to what she had expected." Mia's face was a study in disbelief. "This doesn't make sense," she said, turning to me. "Where's the rest of it? The house? The savings?" "I told you," I replied evenly. "Those aren't in my name." For the first time in this entire ordeal, Mia looked uncertain. Her lawyer, however, wasn't about to give up. He accused me of hiding assets, of manipulating the system, of being dishonest. But Robert was ready. Calmly and methodically, he laid out the timeline of when and how the arrangements had been made. All perfectly legal, all perfectly above board. Mia's lawyer tried to push back. "Surely, Your Honor," he said during the preliminary hearing, "this is a deliberate attempt to deprive my client of her rightful share." But the judge barely glanced up from the documents. "The assets were never in his name," he said plainly. "You can't divide what isn't there." That was the first major blow, and it landed hard. Mia's lawyer scrambled to find a new angle, while Mia herself began to fume. She couldn't understand how the narrative had slipped out of her control. Over the following weeks, the battle lines were drawn. Mia demanded further investigations, convinced I had hidden wealth somewhere. She was relentless, digging into every corner of my life with the same energy she had once reserved for her boutique job. But no matter how hard she and her lawyer tried, they found nothing. My arrangements were solid, my actions beyond reproach. Mia's frustration began to show. Her smugness turned to anger, her confidence to desperation. She started snapping at me during meetings, accusing me of being a liar, a manipulator, a coward. "You're trying to cheat me," she shouted at one point, her voice echoing in the conference room. I didn't respond. What was the point? The truth was out there, plain as day, and no amount of shouting could change it. As the legal proceedings dragged on, I began to feel a strange sense of detachment. It was as though I was watching a movie about someone else's life. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was now a stranger. A combative, bitter stranger who was willing to do whatever it took to come out on top. And yet, through it all, I couldn't help but feel grateful for one thing. I had the foresight to protect myself. Mia thought she could steamroll her way to victory, but she underestimated me. This was a battle I hadn't asked for, but now that I was in it, I wasn't going to back down. By the time Mia realized she wasn't going to waltz away with half of everything, her demeanor shifted from smug to frantic. Her confidence, once towering and unshakable, began to crack. At first, she tried to mask it with defiance, throwing accusations and barbs my way during meetings. But as her lawyer's flashy tactics failed to produce results, desperation took over. Mia's lawyer suggested hiring a forensic accountant, someone to dig deeper into my finances. I wasn't surprised when I received the notice. It was predictable, really. What did surprise me was how far Mia was willing to go. She and her lawyer started reaching out to people in my life, looking for any shred of evidence that I had stashed away assets. My parents, of course, were the first on their list. One Saturday afternoon, my father called, his voice calm as always but tinged with annoyance. "Alex, I just got a call from Mia's lawyer," he said. "He wanted to ask about the house and the trust. I told him to speak to your lawyer, but I thought you should know." I sighed. "Thanks, Dad. Sorry they dragged you into this." He chuckled. "Don't worry about it. Let them dig. They won't find anything." And he was right. The forensic accountant turned up empty-handed, and any attempts to challenge the legality of the trust or the house ownership were swiftly shut down. But Mia wasn't done. When the legal system didn't work in her favor, she turned to the court of public opinion. It started with whispered rumors among our mutual friends. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I wasn't exactly in a socializing mood, and I figured it was natural for people to gossip about a messy divorce. But then, I started getting strange looks and awkward questions. One friend, Melissa, finally pulled me aside during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "Alex, I don't know if you've heard, but Mia's been saying some things," she began hesitantly. "What things?" I asked, already bracing myself. "She's telling people you've been financially abusive, that you manipulated her into giving up her career so you could control her. She said you're hiding money and leaving her with nothing." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Thanks for letting me know, Melissa. I appreciate it." Inside, though, I was furious. Financially abusive? Manipulative? The irony was almost laughable. But there was no use confronting Mia about it. Her actions spoke louder than any defense I could muster. She was spinning her narrative, trying to paint herself as the victim to gain sympathy and leverage. It didn't stop there. She started posting cryptic messages on social media, alluding to being trapped in a toxic marriage and fighting for justice. While she never mentioned my name directly, it didn't take a genius to figure out who she was talking about. Friends and acquaintances began to reach out, some expressing concern, others fishing for details. I chose not to engage. Let her spin her stories. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't about to stoop to her level. My lawyer advised the same. "Stay quiet, Alex," Robert said. "The more she flails, the worse she looks. Focus on the facts. Let her bury herself." And bury herself she did. Her desperation to win, at any cost, began to alienate the very people she was trying to rally to her side. Friends who initially sympathized with her started to see through the cracks in her story. The more dramatic her accusations became, the less credible she sounded. Then came the final, desperate move. One day, out of the blue, Mia showed up at my office. She hadn't set foot there in years, and her sudden appearance caused a stir among my coworkers. She marched past the reception desk, ignoring the startled secretary, and barged into my office uninvited. "Alex," she said, her voice teetering between anger and panic. "This isn't fair. You're leaving me with nothing. After everything I sacrificed for you, you're just going to throw me away?" I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her outburst. "Mia," I said calmly, "you're the one who ended this marriage. You made your choices. I'm just protecting what's mine." Her face twisted with frustration. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming out, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. That encounter marked a turning point. Mia's desperation had reached its peak, and it was becoming increasingly clear that her tactics weren't working. The people around her were growing weary of the drama, and even her lawyer seemed less enthusiastic about the case. Still, I knew better than to relax. Desperation makes people unpredictable, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like the tide was beginning to turn in my favor. The courtroom is nothing like what you see on TV. There's no grandstanding, no dramatic yelling, no sudden revelations that leave everyone gasping. It's a slow, meticulous grind where every word, every piece of evidence, and every detail matters. And let me tell you, being in the middle of it was like sitting through a storm, knowing you couldn't control where the wind would blow next. By the time the legal battles began in earnest, Mia had transitioned from desperate to downright ruthless. Her lawyer, who initially oozed confidence, now operated with a kind of manic determination, throwing every tactic they could at me. They accused me of hiding assets, exploiting loopholes, and manipulating the system to leave Mia with nothing. To anyone unfamiliar with the situation, it might have sounded plausible. But to me, and anyone who bothered to look at the facts, it was pure theatrics. Robert, my lawyer, was unflappable. While Mia's lawyer flailed about, presenting wild theories and speculative arguments, Robert remained calm, methodically dismantling each claim. He wasn't flashy, but he was precise. and precision wins battles like these. The most contentious argument Mia's lawyer made was that her sacrifices as a homemaker had directly contributed to my financial success. They tried to frame her decision to leave her job as a selfless act that had allowed me to thrive in my career. It was a clever angle, I'll admit, but it lacked substance. Robert addressed it head-on. While it's true that Mrs. Carter left her job after marriage, he said during one hearing, this was her decision, not a mutual agreement, and there is no evidence that her choice directly impacted Mr. Carter's earnings or career trajectory. Furthermore, the assets in question were established prior to their marriage and are not considered marital property. Mia's lawyer wasn't ready to give up. They presented text messages and emails, cherry-picking moments where I had thanked Mia for her support or acknowledged her role in our household. But Robert countered with a mountain of financial records that told a very different story. One of careful planning, individual effort, and a clear separation of assets from the start. Then came the affair. Initially, I had hesitated to bring it up, thinking it might come across as petty. But Robert insisted it was relevant, and when the moment came, it hit like a sledgehammer. Mia Carter's relationship with her gym trainer, Ryan, Robert began, presenting a file of evidence. Not only constitutes marital misconduct, but also undermines her claims of being an innocent party in this divorce. This affair was ongoing for months, during which time she neglected her marital responsibilities. The judge listened intently as Robert laid out the timeline, supported by messages, photos, and even a few witnesses who could corroborate the relationship. Mia's lawyer tried to pivot, arguing that the affair had no bearing on the division of assets. But it was clear that the judge wasn't buying it. I watched as Mia squirmed in her seat, her composure cracking under the weight of the revelations. She glared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and humiliation. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This was the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with. But that moment passed quickly. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. The courtroom drama didn't end there. Mia's lawyer pushed hard, trying to paint me as a cold, calculating husband who had manipulated her into a position of dependence. They brought up every possible argument, from the lack of joint accounts to my refusal to include her in major financial decisions. But every time, Robert had an answer. He presented documents, testimonies, and timelines that painted a very different picture. One of a man who had simply protected himself against the unpredictability of life. Mia, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her lawyer's aggressive tactics weren't yielding results, and it was clear that her smear campaign outside the courtroom had backfired. Friends who might have supported her were now keeping their distance, wary of being dragged into the drama. Even her family seemed less enthusiastic about her plight. One particularly telling moment came when Mia took the stand. She delivered an emotional testimony, painting herself as a victim of my supposed manipulations. She cried, talked about her sacrifices, and even tried to portray herself as a devoted wife who had been blindsided by my coldness. But when Robert cross-examined her, the cracks in her story became glaringly obvious. Mrs. Carter, Robert began, his tone measured but firm. You've claimed that you were unaware of the financial arrangements regarding the house and other assets. Is that correct? Yes, Mia replied, her voice trembling. Then how do you explain these text messages? He said, holding up a document, where you and Mr. Carter explicitly discussed keeping the house in his father's name as a precautionary measure? Mia stammered, unable to provide a coherent answer. The room was silent, the tension palpable. It was in that moment that I realized the tide had fully turned. Mia's attempts to vilify me, her aggressive legal strategy, and her emotional appeals had all fallen flat. The truth, steady and unyielding, was on my side. By the end of the hearings, I was exhausted. The process had drained me emotionally, mentally, and even physically. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The battle wasn't over yet, but the scales were tipping in my favor, and there was no going back now. The legal proceedings might have been the centerpiece of the drama, but the personal fallout was just as intense. Perhaps even more so. Mia's once carefully curated life began to crumble piece by piece, and I had a front row seat to the chaos. It started with her relationship with Ryan, her gym trainer, and supposed escape from our marriage. The affair that had seemed so bold and passionate on the surface began to show its cracks under the pressure of the public and legal scrutiny. Rumors about the affair had spread quickly, thanks to our overlapping social circles and the evidence presented during the hearings. Ryan, who had once been the cause of Mia's confidence and brazen demands, started to distance himself. I first heard about it through a mutual friend, Lisa, who had always been a little too eager to share the latest gossip. "Did you hear about Ryan?" she asked one day when we bumped into each other at a coffee shop. "No," I said, although I had a feeling I was about to find out. "Word is he's been avoiding Mia. Apparently, he doesn't want to be dragged into her divorce mess. Can you believe it? He's worried about his reputation." I wasn't surprised. Ryan had always struck me as the type to enjoy the fun of an affair without the responsibility that came with it. When things got messy, he folded like a cheap deck of cards. And without Ryan's support, Mia seemed to spiral even further. Her friends, once loyal and sympathetic, began pulling away as well. At first, they had rallied around her, taking her side and offering their shoulders to cry on. But as her accusations against me grew more outlandish and her behavior more erratic, their patience wore thin. People don't like being dragged into someone else's drama, and Mia's drama was like quicksand, pulling in anyone who got too close. Even her family, who had initially tried to support her, started to retreat. I heard from my lawyer that her parents were frustrated with her decisions, especially her insistence on pursuing an affair while married. They had quietly tried to persuade her to settle the divorce amicably, but Mia wasn't interested in compromise. She was too determined to win, even if it meant alienating everyone around her. The breaking point came when Mia showed up at her lawyer's office unannounced, demanding to know why things weren't going her way. A clerk who overheard the confrontation later relayed the story to Robert. Apparently, Mia had accused her lawyer of being incompetent, claiming he wasn't fighting hard enough for her. The irony was palpable. Her lawyer's aggressive tactics were the only reason the case hadn't been resolved sooner. But Mia wasn't one to take responsibility for her own failures. As her personal relationships unraveled, so did her public image. Mia had spent years crafting the persona of a poised, elegant woman who had it all together. Now that image was in tatters. Her erratic behavior, public outbursts, and increasingly desperate actions had become the talk of our community. People who once admired her now avoided her, whispering about her behind closed doors. One day, I ran into Ryan at the grocery store of all places. He looked uncomfortable, like a deer caught in headlights. I wasn't planning to confront him. I had no interest in starting a scene, but he approached me anyway. "Alex," he began awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. His apology felt hollow, like he was trying to absolve himself of guilt rather than genuinely making amends. "You don't owe me an apology, Ryan," I said finally. "You owe me a one, but I'm guessing that's not happening anytime soon." He looked down, muttered something about moving on, and walked away. It was pathetic, really. The man Mia had risked everything for couldn't even look me in the eye for more than a few seconds. As for Mia, her isolation was almost complete. Her affair had fizzled out. Her friends had turned their backs, and her family had grown distant. Even her social media, once filled with pictures of curated perfection, had gone silent. The woman who had once seemed so untouchable was now a shadow of her former self. Part of me wanted to feel pity for her. After all, this was a woman I had loved, a woman I had planned to spend the rest of my life with. But every time I thought about the choices she had made, the betrayal, the lies, the coldness, I couldn't bring myself to feel anything but relief. Relief that I'd seen her true colors before it was too late. Relief that I had protected myself from the fallout of her actions. The personal fallout wasn't just hers, though. I had my own share of damage to contend with. friends who once saw us as a power couple now looked at me with a mix of pity and curiosity. Some avoided me altogether, unsure of what to say. Others bombarded me with questions, wanting the inside scoop on what had happened. It was exhausting, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my life was dissected by people who barely knew me. But through it all, I kept my focus on what mattered, getting through the divorce and moving on with my life. Mia could burn every bridge she had, but I wasn't about to let her drag me down with her. The storm was still raging, but I could see the skies starting to clear, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was going to be okay. The courtroom was both sterile and suffocating. It was a place where truth was supposed to shine, but in reality, it was a battlefield. Lawyers sparred with words, witnesses stepped into the spotlight, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. For me, it was the culmination of months of tension, lies, and emotional warfare. For Mia, it was her final chance to prove her version of the story. I arrived early that day, dressed in a dark suit and trying to mask the mix of anxiety and anticipation swirling inside me. Robert sat beside me, calm and collected, as always. "Stay steady, Alex," he said. "No matter what they throw at us, the facts are on our side." Mia arrived a little later, wearing a sharp outfit that seemed chosen to project confidence and innocence. But her eyes betrayed her. They flicked nervously around the room, avoiding mine entirely. Her lawyer, looking equally strained, carried a briefcase overflowing with documents, none of which I knew could undo the truth. The proceedings began with opening statements. Mia's lawyer painted a picture of her as a devoted wife who had sacrificed her career and ambitions to support her husband, only to be betrayed by his financial manipulations. "Mrs. Carter has given her all to this marriage," he declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "And now she stands to lose everything because of Mr. Carter's deceitful practices and exploitation of legal loopholes." It was a dramatic start, but I kept my face neutral. Let them have their moment, I thought. It wouldn't last. When Robert stood to give our opening statement, his approach was starkly different. He was calm, methodical, and focused on the facts. "This case is not about sacrifice or emotional appeals," he began. "It's about the law. Mr. Carter has acted within his legal rights at every step, and the claims against him are baseless and unsupported by evidence." Then came the testimonies. Mia took the stand first, and I won't lie. It was difficult to watch. She cried as she recounted the early years of our marriage, claiming she had been blindsided by my financial decisions. "I trusted Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "I never imagined he would set things up this way, leaving me with nothing." Her lawyer pressed her story further, asking leading questions about how she had left her job to focus on our marriage, how she had always believed we were building a life together, and how she now felt abandoned. It was a performance, plain and simple, but it was effective. A few members of the audience looked visibly moved, and even the judge seemed sympathetic, at first. Then it was Robert's turn. He rose from his seat with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the case. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "you've stated that you were unaware of the financial arrangements regarding the house and other assets. Is that correct?" "Yes," Mia replied, her tone defensive. "Then can you explain this email from 3 years ago?" Robert said, holding up a printed document. "Where Mr. Carter explicitly informed you that the house was being placed in his father's name as a precautionary measure?" Mia's face flushed. I don't remember that email," she stammered. Robert pressed on, presenting additional evidence. Text messages, bank statements, and even a notarized agreement Mia had signed early in our marriage, acknowledging the ownership of key assets. Each piece of evidence chipped away at her credibility, and her lawyer's objections grew increasingly frantic. The turning point came when Robert brought up the affair. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice steady but firm, "you've painted yourself as a victim in this marriage. But how do you reconcile that narrative with the fact that you engaged in a months-long affair with your gym trainer, Ryan?" Mia's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge overruled him. "Answer the question," the judge said, his tone sharp. Mia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Robert didn't let up. "You made mistakes," he repeated. "But would you agree that those mistakes were a betrayal of your marital vows and a significant factor in the breakdown of this marriage?" She didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. The courtroom was quiet as Robert presented the evidence of her affair. Text messages, photos, and even a statement from one of her former friends who had been privy to the relationship. By the time he finished, the air was thick with tension. Mia's emotional testimony had been thoroughly dismantled, and her lawyer looked like he was ready to throw in the towel. When I took the stand, Robert's questions focused on the facts. He asked about the timeline of my financial arrangements, the reasons behind my decisions, and the steps I had taken to ensure transparency. I answered honestly and directly, knowing that every word mattered. The judge asked a few questions of his own, probing for clarity on certain points. But by the end of my testimony, it was clear where the case was heading. In his closing statement, Robert tied everything together with the same precision he had shown throughout the trial. "This case is not about emotional appeals or attempts to rewrite the past," he said. "It's about the law, and the law is clear. Mr. Carter has acted within his rights, and the claims against him are unfounded." As the hearing ended, I glanced at Mia. She looked defeated, her earlier confidence replaced by a grim realization. The storm we had both been caught in was finally nearing its end, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The day of the verdict felt like the end of a marathon, a mix of exhaustion, anticipation, and a desperate hope that it had all been worth it. I arrived early, sitting in the same cold courtroom that had been the stage for this battle over the past few months. The tension in the air was palpable, a silence broken only by the shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur from the audience. Mia arrived late, as she often did. She walked in with an air of forced confidence, her head held high, but her face betrayed her nervousness. She hadn't looked at me since the last hearing, and today was no different. She sat down next to her lawyer, who whispered something to her that seemed to only deepen her frown. The judge entered, and we all stood. It was a formality, but the weight of the moment was anything but. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. After reviewing the evidence, testimonies, and legal arguments presented by both parties, this court has reached a decision regarding the division of assets and the terms of this divorce. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Firstly," the judge continued, "regarding the property in question, the evidence clearly shows that the house is legally owned by Mr. Carter's father and was never part of the marital assets. Therefore, Mrs. Carter has no claim to the property." Mia's face fell, but she kept her composure. Her lawyer, however, leaned back in his chair, visibly deflated. "Secondly," the judge said, turning to the financial accounts and investments, "these assets are part of a family trust established before the marriage. As such, they are exempt from division under marital property laws." The words felt like a victory lap, but I kept my face neutral. This wasn't about gloating. It was about protecting what was rightfully mine. Lastly, the judge addressed the issue of alimony. While Mrs. Carter has claimed that her contributions as a homemaker warrant significant compensation, the evidence does not support these claims. However, the court recognizes her need for financial support during the transition period following this divorce. Mia perked up slightly at this, but her relief was short-lived. Therefore, Mrs. Carter is awarded alimony in the amount of $2,000 per month for a period of 6 months. After this time, she is expected to secure her own means of financial independence. There it was, the final blow. Mia's demands for the house, the savings, and the investments were denied, leaving her with a fraction of what she had expected. The alimony was minimal and temporary, just enough to prevent her from claiming she was left with nothing. As the judge concluded, he looked directly at both of us. Divorce is never an easy process, but it is the court's responsibility to ensure a fair and lawful resolution. I hope both parties can use this as an opportunity to move forward and rebuild their lives." With that, he adjourned the court, and the room erupted into murmurs. I shook Robert's hand, thanking him for his impeccable work. "You did it," I said, my voice steady but filled with relief. "No, Alex," he replied. "We did it. You trusted the process and you stayed the course. That's why we won." Across the room, Mia was visibly shaken. Her lawyer was speaking to her in hushed tones, but she wasn't listening. Instead, she stood abruptly, turned to me, and shouted, "This isn't fair. You cheated me. The system is broken." Her outburst silenced the room. All eyes were on her as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, or sadness for what we had lost. But it was fleeting. Mia had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The battle was over, and I had come out intact. The assets I had worked so hard to protect were safe, and more importantly, I could finally start to put this chapter behind me. Outside the courthouse, I paused to take a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs. The chaos, the lies, the legal warfare. It was all behind me now. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could move forward without the shadow of Mia looming over me. I called my father on the way home to let him know the outcome. "Good job, son," he said. "I knew you'd pull through." "Thanks, Dad," I replied, my voice lighter than it had been in a long time. "I couldn't have done it without your advice." He laughed. "Well, now you know why I was so insistent. Always protect yourself, Alex. It's the best thing you can do." As I hung up, I thought about his words and the journey that had brought me to this point. The verdict wasn't just a legal victory. It was a turning point, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. And for that, I was deeply, profoundly grateful. Sitting in the quiet of my now empty home, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come since the storm began. The walls, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, now held a silence that was both heavy and liberating. This house, though not legally mine, felt more like my sanctuary than it ever had during my marriage with Mia. Perhaps because now it was no longer a battlefield. The day after the verdict, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The emotional roller coaster of betrayal, the long hours of legal wrangling, and the countless sleepless nights were behind me. And while the scars were still fresh, I knew they would heal with time. I couldn't stop thinking about my father's advice, the foresight that had protected me from losing everything. He'd always been practical, almost to a fault, and at the time, I thought his insistence on safeguarding my assets was unnecessary. But now, I saw it for what it was, wisdom born from experience. I called him that morning, not just to thank him, but to share my thoughts. "Dad," I said, my voice steady but thoughtful, "you saved me, you know that? If I hadn't listened to you back then, I don't even want to think about where I'd be right now." He chuckled on the other end of the line. "Son, I didn't save you. I just gave you the tools. You're the one who kept your head when things got tough. And let me tell you, I'm proud of you for that." Those words meant more than I could express. For so long, I'd felt like I was constantly on the defensive, reacting to Mia's moves and fighting to keep my footing. But now, with everything settled, I realized I had emerged stronger than I'd ever been before. The next few weeks were all about rebuilding, not just in the practical sense, sorting out the logistics of my finances and making plans for the future, but also emotionally. I allowed myself time to grieve, not for Mia, but for the life I thought we'd have together. The betrayal had cut deep, but what hurt more was the realization that the woman I'd married no longer existed. Or maybe she never had. Despite everything, I didn't harbor hatred toward her. Anger, yes. Disappointment, absolutely. But hatred, that would only weigh me down. Mia had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I wouldn't waste my energy on bitterness. My focus was on moving forward, on building a life that was truly mine. I started reconnecting with friends I'd distanced myself from during the chaos. Some were hesitant, unsure of how to approach me after everything that had happened. Others welcomed me back with open arms, eager to help me find my footing again. Those moments reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I'd felt like I was. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, I thought about the lessons this ordeal had taught me. Trust is a fragile thing, easily broken and not so easily repaired. But more than that, I'd learned the value of resilience. No matter how many times life knocked me down, I'd always find a way to get back up. The silence around me wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of someone else's expectations or demands pressing down on me. This was my life, and I was determined to live it on my terms. A few days later, I decided to take a small trip, a symbolic step toward starting fresh. I packed a bag, got in the car, and drove out to the countryside, where the pace of life was slower and the air felt cleaner. I spent the weekend hiking, reading, and simply being present. It was exactly what I needed. A reminder that there was still beauty in the world, even after everything I'd been through. When I returned home, I felt renewed. The house didn't feel as empty anymore. Instead, it felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to paint a new chapter of my life. I started making plans, small at first, like redecorating the living room or picking up a new hobby. But eventually, those plans grew bigger. A career shift, maybe. A chance to travel more. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about the future. As I sit here now writing this reflection, I can't help but feel grateful. Not for the pain or the betrayal, but for the lessons they taught me. Life is unpredictable, and people aren't always who they seem. But with the right mindset, the right support, and a little bit of foresight, you can weather any storm. I don't know what the future holds, and that's okay. What I do know is that I'm ready for whatever comes next. And as I close this chapter of my life, I do so with the knowledge that I've come out stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build the life I deserve.